So with that, we'll kind of jump into our program here today. I was inspired by this and inspired to take the first Tuesday talk slot on the calendar because we just had the 4th of July on Saturday, and it's a very timely topic to think back. And I was struck by just how many different celebrations and festivals Saugatuck has had. You know, I'm not going to talk about the Venetian Festival, but that's another one with a really storied history and lots of connections to some of these other community celebrations. But I was really struck by, you know, Saugatuck and Douglas love a good excuse for a party, right? And to get organized and do some activities and commemorate history. So many Centennial celebrations. This was a bumper sticker from our collection from the Bicentennial, and it stood out to me. It's like, wow, how many different kind of anniversaries can you kind of roll into one here, right? So Saugatuck, a big celebration in 1930 that we'll talk about, commemorating William and Mary Wells Butler coming up the Kalamazoo River and essentially founding and platting the village of what becomes Saugatuck in 1830. So there's a big celebration 100 years later with that, well before Michigan achieves official statehood in 1837, and then of course 1776, the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And we'll hear a little more about that in a moment. But lots of enthusiasm in the 19th and 20th centuries, in particular, for marking these key dates and anniversaries, and a real sense of civic purpose and creating meaning around these anniversaries too, which I'll try to explore a little bit in the short time that we have. So I just called out a few examples. The Bicentennial, the front page of the Commercial Record from July of 1976, the 1968 newspaper, and this is just after Art and Kit Lane, the husband and wife duo that owned and edited and wrote for the Commercial Record in Saugatuck starting in about 1966, 1967, and also the Fenville Herald. And I think they were the only husband and wife dual editors of newspapers in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. So Kit, they both did a little bit of everything, but Kit Lane was the editor-in-chief of the Fenville Herald, and Art Lane in charge of the Commercial Record in this time period. But the newspaper also marked its 100th anniversary in 1968. A very worn but fascinating broadside of the Saugatuck Homecoming Centennial in 1930, commemorating the founding of the village, and then another broadsheet that lists the activities of the grand celebration in Saugatuck on July 4th, 1876, for the centennial of the 100 years of independence. So I'll try to put some of these in context for you a little bit, and also just share what we do know about these different moments in history as we roll along here. But I thought we'd start right at the present day. I pulled some photos off of the Saugatuck page and other Facebook pages and looked at how Saugatuck celebrated the U.S. semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary this year. And hopefully, kind of think about this as we look at some of these later photos of, like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The elements of having a parade are central to all of these celebrations over time. There's a certain patriotic fervor, obviously, right, of kind of looking at this kind of pride of place and the occasion of remembering the Declaration of Independence, remembering the ideals of political liberty, enlightenment, self-governance, kind of shine through these, and a certain kind of activist spirit, and also, right, a certain love of frivolity and celebration, exuberance that's a part of it as well. So, the parade route that we see here from just this last weekend, the Indivisibles float, very politically minded and kind of clear iconography of the SOS message, kind of calling for some maybe deeper reflection on the state of democracy and political institutions, and also pie eating, right? Pie eating contest down at Wicks Park, and we see that gazebo there that we'll learn a little bit more about the history of in just a moment. So things kind of come full circle, as we'll see, and I'll bring out some examples as we go along, as we move backwards and jump around a bit in time, and think about celebrations, and particularly centennial type celebrations. So I think we all know the basic outline, right, of why the 4th of July, the adoption of the Declaration of Independence by the Second Continental Congress is officially ratified on July the 4th, and we recognize this scene from the very faithful depiction of the interior of the old State House in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress met, painted by noted American painter John Trumbull, but painted in 1817, right? And so quite a few years after, right, after the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence, which then took place quite a bit after this. I didn't bring the clip in to show, but how many of you have seen the HBO series John Adams, right? And so there's a lot of depiction. There's a really good depiction of that, of kind of reflecting on by Adams himself and by other elder statesmen, you know, here almost 20 years after, more than 20 years after independence, on the kind of ways that the meaning of history gets constructed over time, right? Fun trivia about the painting, which is in the US Capitol Rotunda. It has been since the 1820s. Not all of the signers that are on what we think of as as one of the official copies that's been widely reproduced of the Declaration of Independence, and the gentleman depicted here, we're not all in the room at the same time, right? So lots of people kind of coming and going over this time. Also, Trumbull painted the figures from life whenever possible, but many of the signers had died since 1776, and so this is, as all history is, right, a bit of a composite, right, of different sources and different stories that are brought together as we understand this. What's the impact of the Declaration of Independence, right? So it's ratified by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And unlike our age of threads and Facebook, and it took some time for this message to get out, right? Immediately the text was sent to the printer in Philadelphia, to John Dunlap, and copies were made, and then they were sent out, right, by horseback, right, people through the mail, and it took some time for these to actually make their way around to different people within what had been the 13 colonies, right? And so it's not until July the 8th and then July the 9th that the Declaration of Independence is read aloud in New York City, and the reaction to that is a pretty swift one. And the reaction to that was the Continental Army and other anti-loyalist folks, pro-American independence folks, immediately go and start rioting, right? They start attacking loyalists that were still living in New York City, and most famously, they attacked the equestrian bronze sculpture of King George III in Battery Park at the very southern tip of Manhattan. And this is a much later painting, but of an image kind of depicting these sort of rebellious Americans inspired by the Declaration of Independence, this declaration of freedom from the crown. And they attack the sculpture of George III. So this kind of iconoclastic moment. Fragments of that sculpture survive at the New York Historical Society, but most of the sculpture was melted down and was made into bullets. Exactly, yeah. So it was actually used to support the revolutionary cause. So thinking about this moment in 1776, it's worth noting that the Revolutionary War has been underway for well over a year at this point, since spring of 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord, and really going back several years prior to that, right? If we dig into that history of all of the coercive acts and Stamp Act and other political troubles, right, between London and the metropolis and these colonies, particularly in Boston and in New England. But to bring us back to kind of thinking about the commemorations of the 4th of July and of Independence Day, right, we can see early records of what life was like and the way that Americans, after the end of the American Revolution in 1783, began thinking about themselves as Americans, particularly after the War of 1812 concludes, right? So there's kind of the completion of that revolutionary fervor and of that independence from Great Britain after this second war with the British Empire in 1812 and ending in 1815. And so just a couple of examples to kind of give us a little sense of the flavor of this. So a very early painting from 1821 by Philadelphia German painter John Lewis Krimmel. And this is a painting of the 4th of July in Center Square, where the big city hall is located today, if you've been to Philadelphia, where William Penn is up on top of that Second Empire style building. Krimmel was well known for his genre scenes or scenes of everyday life, and that's very much what this is. He was influenced by William Hogarth, the great 18th century British satirist, and so a little connection to the old world and the old empire, if you will. But looking at the painting, what are some things that we see here? People are gathered. This is a day off, a day away from work, and people have come into the city, into this Central Park area. Krimmel takes some effort to depict kind of the variety of people, this sense of, I'd say, of kind of a broad democratic populace, right, that represents very high class, well-to-do folks, finely dressed, to more common folks, maybe from the countryside. There's some figures plainly dressed as Quakers that he includes in this mix, which were a large religious group in Philadelphia at the time, and some African American figures as well, scattered throughout the crowd. So a sense of diversity in Philadelphia at this time, and also of kind of the promise of modernity in the new republic, the new American republic. So the fountain that we see here, we take for granted water, running water, but this is an engineering marvel of the time. That's a result of extensive waterworks that are built in steam-driven pumping stations that create water pressure to actually have water service throughout the city by the 1820s. And this is the sculpture that you see there, a wooden sculpture by noted American sculptor William Rush, who was based in Philadelphia and connected with the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, where this work lives today as part of their collection there. So lots of allegory, lots of drawing from scenes of everyday life, and also a pretty kind of casual, simple depiction of like celebrating independence in Philadelphia in 1820. So looking at what's happening in Saugatuck, jumping ahead to the Bicentennial of 1876, we get a sense of very much still a town that is a year after the end of Singapore, the closing of the mills at Singapore in 1875, but really thriving in America's wooden age, and also very much connected to the larger world. We think about celebrating American independence in southwestern Michigan, what are some things that are happening? So probably a little small for you all to read sitting back there in the chairs. I've got a larger detail in a moment, but I was going to give you this list describes the order of exercises for the day. So basically, what's the program of events that's happening in Saugatuck? And what is there? A salute of 13 guns at sunrise, a procession around the town. After the exercises are finished, there's some athletic events, some frivolity, more frivolity along the river with log races, canoe races, and tub races, and then dances, picnics, and excursions, and then, of course, ending with, what would you expect this to end with in the nighttime? Fireworks, exactly right, yeah. So looking at this, I thought this was really fascinating. We think of parades, I think, as, I don't think we think a lot about why we have parades. I think there's something fun to go look at. It's a chance to honor important people and for organizations to show off and be visible. But in the 18th century and 19th century tradition, right, this was especially important, right? And so there was a very clearly delineated order of things, an order to society, an order of hierarchy, and we still see that reflected in our parades today, but maybe not in quite as, I'd say, maybe as intensive a way as it was in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. So looking at the map here, it mentions that the procession will form at the foot of Butler Street in front of the Oddfellows Hall, and then march through the principal streets to Morrison's Grove. It's not exactly clear to me what that means, what the principal streets would be, but we'd sort of imagine walking down Butler Street, and I would assume maybe making a loop on Water Street, and then ending up what's described here as Morrison's Grove in the 1770s and 1780s. And I believe that, from what I can tell, and if someone knows better, please let me know, would be this area that Morrison sold to the Newnhams, kind of at the edge of Allegan and kind of at the edge of Saugatuck. There are newspaper references describing this as an area where there were religious camp meetings, camp revival took place in the 1880s, and then it's developed by the 1880s and 1890s. So we'll look into that. I'm interested to look into that story a little bit more. It's sort of interesting point of description here in the early history of Saugatuck in the 1870s. But this sense of procession was clearly understood by people reading this in 1876, and they knew where Morrison's Grove was and where they could expect to be found. Giving a little bit of context for this close to home, we could talk about the Centennial in 1876 for the rest of the hour, particularly the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, one of the early World's Fairs that was held in the United States. We'll kind of I'll rein it in a little bit here. But this is a lovely photograph that a stereo card of a Centennial view of Grand Rapids, looking at Campo Square, kind of near the area where the Art Museum is today, in downtown Grand Rapids from July 4th, 1876. And they built this big Centennial arch over the street. No record of anything quite that elaborate in Saugatuck, but the concept was very much the same, right? This idea of a very organized procession of important officials and organizations and businesses within the town, and then also kind of carnivalesque aspect to it, right? So the sense of people kind of getting a little crazy, dressed up in wild costumes and out, having a good time, creating a little bit of mayhem in the city for a day. All right, you might be able to read this better. I can certainly read it a little bit better. So I'll talk a little more about who are some of these folks that are here. So the order of exercises, we had the guns early on, the procession through town, and then you need music, you need a band, ideally, if you're gonna have a good parade. So they had the Saugatuck Silver Cornet Band, and then the cannon and color bearers rolling through the streets. The engine and fire company, fire department, we'll see a photo of the fire department from the late 19th century later. The mayor and common council, the orator who's going to give our speech later in the day, Judge Atwood of Grand Rapids, who made the trip out to Saugatuck. You need a good orator who's going to give you the long talk after the parade. And then young ladies representing the goddess of liberty in the different states. So that kind of emblematic tradition again. We had a Statue of Liberty in our parade this past weekend. Old ladies dressed in ancient costumes to represent the old 13 states.
Old ladies, ancient, that's not right.
Probably 40. Ancient costumes from 100 years previous, right? So ye old colonial times to represent the 13 states. Martial bands, so I think one of the military band was playing here. Falstaff and his brigade, in parentheses, horribles. So these were these kind of, this was this kind of carnivalesque aspect of this, that people were dressed in costumes and, doing pranks and being, kind of being ribald and a little wild on the street. Delegations from neighboring towns. I'm not sure who came, if, Glen or Fenville or Holland sent people to this. Citizens in carriage, and then citizens on foot, right? So there's kind of this clear, you get this sense of hierarchy, both in terms of importance, political importance or economic importance, class status, and then, kind of the lowest level, the folks on foot, which we could think not just as an 18th century idea, but really like a medieval idea, right? This kind of hierarchy of the classes, the order of society. And while we've got this up here, I mentioned this already, but it's just worth pointing this out a little bit more of the specifics. So after the procession is done, and then go to the public square, right, where the tennis courts are, where the Republican Liberty Pole was located in the 1870s. A 100-yard foot race, prize $3. Not bad, good to be fast. A blindfold race, a jumping match, some kind of long jump, standing jump, a sack race, we'd recognize that today. Vaulting, leaping, and various other games will be instituted as the committee may deem proper. Making it up as they go along. This is my favorite part, though. The people will then assemble at the river and witness contests for log races, canoe races, and tub races. So you could get in a wooden tub and row down the river, float down the river. And then there we go. So you get a sense people, if you think of these Victorian folks in the 1870s as being real serious and not a lot of fun. If we paint with a broad brush, but what's more fun than watching a tub race, That's a good time. Falstaff and his brigade of horribles, right? This sounds like a pretty fun time. So, the Centennial was a big deal. I think, just to connect the dots here a little bit as well, it's the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of America's birth as a nation. It's also 11 years after the end of the American Civil War. It's the end of Reconstruction in 1875. And there's a lot of desire to look backwards, as we see with that acknowledgement of old ladies dressed in ancient costumes. But there's also this sense of like, let's move on. Let's move on into this new century and not think about what we would call, post-traumatic stress disorder of veterans that survived the American Civil War, and the spirit of Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, which in many ways, is the birth of, or the advance of Jim Crow era in the United States. This kind of retreat away from civil rights, particularly for people of color and immigrants in the 1880s and after. 1930, is another moment here, looking back now, we're talking almost 50 years, a little less than 50 years later from the Centennial. And in Saugatuck, like many communities outside of the East Coast, outside the original 13 colonies, it's also a moment when many of the communities and the states themselves celebrate their big 100th year anniversary, right? So think of that 1876, it's like kind of the prequel to, all right, we had this great celebration of America's birthday, 100-year anniversary. It's our turn, right? We've got history too, and we're going to acknowledge that and celebrate that. So looking at this, what's going on in Saugatuck in 1830, they planned 3 days of events. I think it's also interesting, just right off the top, to think about this not just as a centennial, but as it's described in its own terms as a homecoming, right? And what we know about Saugatuck and its history, right, there's a lot of people that come here and a lot of people that leave here, right? Midwestern settlement is one of migration of migrants primarily from New England in the 1830s and 1840s that come here. And many of them, and their children in particular, continue going west, right? They go west to Illinois, to Chicago, to Wisconsin, to the west coast of the United States, to the southwest. So it's a homecoming event. It's designed not just for people who are living here in 1930, but also people that are going to come back and either visit relatives or go see relatives who may be buried here, right? And go explore those family roots and that family history. And so this discovery of history, and we might say on the one hand nostalgia, we might say on the other hand more specifically kind of colonial revival sentiment, is at a peak in the 1920s and 1930s. People are looking for their history. They're looking to be connected to that earlier history and to be a part of something that makes them American, right, in particular. And so this is an event that's very much shaped by some of those forces. Yeah?
I just was going to tell you, I don't know if you know, but May Frances Heath
Yes.
was the chairwoman.
Yes, that is a great connection to make.
Council appointed her, and she and the Women's Club took it over,
Yes,
and they went, oh, just amazing with it.
they did amazing things, absolutely. Yeah, I for the sake of time, I won't go too deep into that, but there's a lot to explore about May Frances Heath, who was the granddaughter of original settlers of the Hutchins family, right?
Morrison?
The Morrisons, right. And she writes in 1930, she's inspired to write, as she describes this history, of her early memories of Saugatuck from 1830, the early history of Saugatuck in its first century, 1830 to 1930. In large part, basically, she's inspired to write this because she's up in age at this point, in her 60s, I think, and she's lived this history. Her grandparents, she knew settlers. She knew first-generation settlers that came here. And so she's writing her family history and the history of people that she knew and stories that she heard herself, and wrote this in the early memories of Saugatuck book, which comes out for this 1930 centennial. Let me back up for just a second here. Well worth reading as a key work in the historiography of the history of the area. I'll stop here and look at this. But I just want to kind of tell you some of the things that happened as part of this homecoming in 1930. And as Peg shared, Frances Heath was absolutely essential to organizing this. And just as a little foreshadowing, a point to keep in mind is like how important, as we talk about these centennials, like these were things organized by women almost exclusively. Many of the early historians were women. We mentioned Kit Lane already. We'll talk more about her in a moment. May Frances Heath, another really important early historian that we know much of what we know because of the work that they did, the writing that they did, and research that they did at the time. Okay, so Centennial Homecoming, July, not on the 4th, but a little bit later in the month. And what's going on in Saugatuck? You know there's going to be a parade, and on Tuesday there's a parade at 10 o'clock. Parade of floats, cash prizes for best old time, best modern, most unique, most beautiful, best Saugatuck floats, best trimmed car, best kiddies car, and the best 3 bands in the parade. So you get the sense of this, there's a lot of categories. There's a lot of people getting entered into this. They're leading with the cash prizes as well. They want to get people really inspired to do something impressive and bring the quality of this up. There's a water carnival, just like we heard about in 1876. There's boats and hijinks on the Kalamazoo, as the quote from this that's right here. And then the Chicago and Jackson Park Yacht Clubs come for their annual water regatta, which is an interesting bit of history there. And then the Venetian Night Parade follows from that here. Jumping around a little bit, well, I'll come back to that in a second. Finally, morning motor trips to visit old landmarks. So there's a desire to go see the sites and ruins and relics of the area. Dedication of the old Indian burial ground. We'll talk about that in a moment. Speaking and musical program at the Big Pavilion. The Big Pavilion is right there in the center of the action that's going on. And then a ball game between the House of David and local teams, preceded by the House of David members parade. And that's on Wednesday, so that's a second day from all of this. But the earlier events that happened too, there's other baseball games, and there's also, as it says here at the very beginning of this, reception and registration each day at the Village Hall. So there's a lot of attention in these events. Go ahead.
You know, you mentioned prizes here and then prizes on the other one where the different races were like $5 was the prize.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to get a perspective of what would that be in today's terms.
Yeah, that's great.
$156.
Wow,
so
yeah.
That's quite generous.
Yeah, that's a highly motivating prize for somebody to win that 100-yard dash. That's really a nice sum of money that they're taking away from that. Yeah.
There's no mention of the original settlements of the Indians. They had the burial ground, but were there any other guests?
I'll get to that in just a second. Yeah, just a second. So one acknowledgement here up front, which we didn't hear about in 1876 whatsoever, right, is the mention of Indians, the burial ground, and of Indian relics. So among the things to see at Village Hall, Saugatuck City Hall today, are exhibits. Not only is there a reception and registration there if you're coming in for the homecoming, coming into this event, there's an exhibit of Indian relics each day at the Village Hall. You can also go visit the Taylor Art School, which is open. So Cora Bliss Taylor, we'll learn more about at the end of the month. Some Cora Bliss Taylor artwork around us right here. An exhibition of Saugatuck paintings by Saugatuck artists at the Saugatuck Women's Club each afternoon of the Centennial. The Columbine Garden Club Flower Show is happening, and some more baseball and old-time costume ball taking place at the pavilion on the first night as well. But the question here was about Indigenous people, Anishinaabe people. How do they fit into this story? And we'll talk a little more about the hall for a second. So looking at the history of Saugatuck's Village Hall, the transformation of it from what it looked like in the 1880s when it was primarily the fire station and hall above, to how it looks today. This transformation over the course of the late 1920s is in part very practical, and in part a kind of colonial revival moment. So the painter and artist Carl Herman and architect Carl Herman redesigns the building, and you see that it goes from this very utilitarian structure here with a cupola so you can get ventilation through the building for the horses and the fire hoses and pumps that need to be dried out. It's transformed into something that looks like it could be from Saugatuck, Connecticut, right? From the 1700s or early 1800s, this sort of delicate fan-light window, half-round window in the dormer, all kinds of lovely kind of architectural details with this surround, with its Tuscan columns that we see kind of framing the entrance to the building. One of the other things that happens when the fire department moves out of the building, and I said we'd see an example of that here. This is an image from, I don't see a date, 1905, of what is Village Hall when the fire company operated out of that first floor. And you can see the stairs up to the second floor meeting space, and those garage doors essentially where all this equipment would come out of here. They're very modern in 1925, by 1925, with an actual fire engine and powered pumps that they can operate. And you can see that transformation of the building. I can really see the details of that as well. But the other thing that happens with the building, bear with me a second here, I lost my pointer, there we go, is the dedication of this monument, originally across the street from its current location. But this was a monument that's dedicated in 1930, and this is a clipping from the commercial record describing this dedication after the Centennial Homecoming in 1930. The old Indian burial ground was dedicated Wednesday about noon. Reverend Zerby from Ganges was the speaker. The high school band played and the scouts sang. Johnson Fox unveiled the memorial boulder. And so what is the story that's behind this? So Kit Lane wrote a little bit more about it. So in around 1929, they excavated a basement underneath the Village Hall. And in the course of those excavations, they found a number of Anishinaabe ancestors that had been buried there, likely in the 1700s. And then some of those remains, some of those ancestors went off to the University of Michigan, to the Anthropological Museum there, and others were lost over time. The artifacts that were mentioned in the first, that were mentioned here in this dedication as being on display, those Indian relics, old Indian relics on view in the hall, eventually disappeared without any trace in the 19th century. And so Kit Lane recovers some of this story a bit more about the dedication of this marker in 1930, and describes that the stone to the memory of the old Indian burial ground was dedicated with ceremony at the 1930 celebration of Centennial. Johnson Fox, the Fox family still here in the Saugatuck area, then just a boy, remembers being the one who actually spoke the words of dedication dressed in an Indian outfit made by his mother.
Johnson?
Yeah.
Johnson Fox?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was probably our current one and only.
Exactly. So to kind of complete that story, just in the last 5 years, because of the NAGPRA Act, the Native American Graves and Artifacts Repatriation Act signed in the 1990s, ancestors that were found in Saugatuck as part of that project, as part of that excavation in 1930, were repatriated, I believe, to the Gun Lake tribe just in the last few years from the collections at the University of Michigan. So extensive and sort of difficult negotiations to make that happen, even though that's been a law for 30 plus years. For the sake of time, kind of moving along, but these are, with all those prize and incentives, there were 56 different floats that were entered into the 1930 Centennial Parade. Starting with the Saugatuck Fire Department, which we saw a photo of, their snazzy 1920s fire rig, and then the Saugatuck Fire Department with their old equipment. So you can see this progress from the new to what had come before. A whole long list of folks, the Fruit Growers State Bank, second in line after the fire company, and a whole host of everything from camps to orchestras to the Grand Army, the Republic, the U.S. Post Office, Congregational Ladies Aid, and so on and down. Quite fascinating. Douglas is represented here too as Dingleville delegation that's marching here in the parade as well. So, and just again to kind of give you, I was really struck by this one example, to give you a sense of the past is never all that past, right? In 1930, there were Civil War veterans, right, that were still recently served, older veterans, but that are here in this parade in 1930. All right, so you got to think about that kind of passage of history. Mindful of time, I'm going to move through the real bicentennial story here in a second, but there's just so many fascinating little details to pick up. This is one reminiscence from the bicentennial era, talking about a piece that James Sheridan had wrote about all the different celebrations that happened over the years in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is a photograph reproduced in the commercial record of the watermelon contest of 1931, which, if I understand this concept correctly, and someone explains to me, I think there was just watermelons in the water and you just went and tried to catch a watermelon. I think was the gist of this here. A mad scramble with melons and contestants, some in boats, some swimming, heading in all directions. So that kind of frivolity and chaos, was a big part of civic life in this era.
Try to get them from one end to the other.
Yeah, I think you got to keep one would be my understanding. It was like free watermelon, as well as the sport of it. So we'll hear more about Nat Steinberg at the end of the month, and there's some great examples of his artwork that we have on display here, including a Saugatuck Village Centennial poster from 1968, which he designed. The 1968 Centennial is the 100th anniversary of Saugatuck officially becoming a village, becoming incorporated by the state as a municipality, as a local government in 1868. And so another great opportunity for a 100-year party, right? Let's have a centennial. It's been 38 years since the 1930 centennial. And so in many ways too, I think this sets up as another kind of trial run for the big bicentennial in 1976. And so Kit Lane, also fortuitous timing for Saugatuck and Douglas. I mentioned earlier they move here in about 1967, and they take over the newspaper. And as Kit Lane describes it in her writing in Reminiscence, right, she becomes a very quick study with this 100th anniversary in 1968 coming up. And as editor of the newspaper, or writer for the newspaper, dives in to produce all kinds of great stories, mining the archives of one of the oldest continuously operating newspapers in the state of Michigan, the Commercial Record, which went through a number of different names, from the Saugatuck Commercial back in 1868 up to the Commercial Record that is known as today. So Kit Lane in her studio, in her study, surrounded by many of the books that she had written. I think over 40 or 50 books that she wrote in her lifetime, not just about the Lakeshore area, but around the world and around the Great Lakes. She was featured in our Her Story exhibit a couple of years ago now. A really key figure for the Historical Society, and it's in the aftermath of the Centennial in 1968, that she founds what is the Saugatuck Historical Museum in the back of the, or lower level of the Commercial Record Building on Lake Street. We're fortunate to have this pastel of the building from about 1981, and this great newspaper advertisement for the museum from 1976. So if you came for the Centennial, if you came for the Bicentennial in 1976 in Saugatuck, you could view this, what is really the predecessor to the Historical Society in many, many ways. We're fortunate that a few years ago now, the original sign from the Historical Museum appeared in a barn and made its way here to the History Center. So this is pretty great. This is the original sign that was on the museum, coming to a future exhibit at some point. But the Village Centennial in 1968 follows many of the same patterns we saw before. The Saugatuck Women's Club playing a key role in the organizing of it, and many of the figures that we see there. Lots of floats, lots of great floats, like we saw in 1930, pulled by cars, decorated cars, and so on. And then we'll just launch in here to talk a little bit about 1976 and the Bicentennial. And you all lived through it. You all have some firsthand connection with that, unlike the other events we talked about. I pulled some examples from an item that came in our collection recently from Nat Steinberg's papers of this Newsweek magazine. Just the full color. I think the impact of color printing is so dramatic for us. Boy, don't we wish we had color photographs of 1876, right? But we don't, right? We're pretty limited in the visual material that survives. But we get a sense of these examples, many from Michigan and around the country, the kind of exuberance, red, white, and blue, everything, colonial revival, everything. And as we dig into this, thinking about the history of the Bicentennial, we get a real sense of this in part from what survives, the records that we have. And we're really fortunate that this notebook, scrapbook that was put together by Jeannie Hallgren after this Bicentennial was at the library, and then the library donated to the History Center here several years ago now. But it's just kind of wonderful, kind of very personal example of how we know about history, how things survive to our own time. So this is an item from our archives, and I just highlighted a couple of things here that I'll show you, and we'll go through with relative quickness because it builds on so many things we've seen already and is very familiar to us as well. So this group is organized in the days, really in the years prior to the Bicentennial. And Kit Lane wrote a little history. She was very involved with the Bicentennial project in Saugatuck Township. And she writes, I'll just read a little bit of her writing. The hoopla for the Bicentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence started more than a year before the actual event. A local Bicentennial committee was appointed, and members from each village in the township and several organizations became members. I'm not sure how I came to be on it, but for some reason I missed the first few meetings. By the time I got to the meetings, under the chairmanship of Ben Warble, they decided, what's it?
I'm sorry.
Warble? Okay, Roble. They had decided that the major Bicentennial project would be a bandstand in the Riverside Park on Water Street in Saugatuck. The park had been purchased more than 20 years earlier with the generous assistance of Frank Wicks, former owner of the Maplewood Hotel and village president and council member. It had been leased to help pay off its indebtedness. Now the lease was expiring, and the city wanted to make it into a real public park dedicated to Mr. Wicks. Local artist Nat Steinberg, a former editorial artist for Chicago's America, had designed an early octagonal bandstand, and the project was on track. So we'll kind of skip ahead to that for a second here. And lo and behold, this is our design for the bandstand by Nat Steinberg, pictured here in the lower left, and kind of lovely rendering of this from 1975. And I just included in here, also from the scrapbook of the Bicentennial Committee, is a copy of this photograph dated from 1885 of the cornet band, who we heard an early reference to an earlier cornet band in 1876 in front of, look at this, a bandstand, gazebo bandstand that was at the village square. And you can actually see, looking at this, this pole that sort of fades off in the distance is that Republican Liberty pole that was installed after the American Civil War. So this was really the focus of energy for much of the fundraising and much of the work that the Bicentennial Committee did through 1975 and 1976 and afterwards. And so a little bit of the history of this here, right? Anchor Park is kind of this location of the chain ferry, and also where there were amusements, miniature golf, paddle boats, canoe and bicycle rentals run by the Hoffman family in the 1960s and into the 1970s. So that reference that Kit Lane makes to kind of turning this into a formal public park is sort of the expiration of that lease, and then putting some amenities into this space that will, as the editorial opinion, probably written by Art or Kit Lane, says, let's make it a park. For 7 years, people have been coming to Saugatuck because it's on the water, and this is a great place. You can get a view and enjoy downtown Saugatuck and enjoy the view along the Kalamazoo River. And they're ultimately successful. They raise quite a bit of money to do this, and photographs of the construction. This is in June of 1976. They're well on their way, and of course the goal is that it's done for the 4th of July in time for all this oration and bands and the parade that's going to happen that's going to take place by Wicks Park. And ultimately they're successful, right? So lots of photographs of the gazebo. This is a much later photograph from the 20-teens. Of a music in the park concert. But I love this. There's a number of photographs that gazebo appears in, bandstand appears in many, many of these photographs as we go along. All right. Nat Steinberg, who is impetus for both the Centennial in Saugatuck and in Douglas. We left Douglas out. In 1970, Douglas celebrates its centennial as well as a formal village, and Nat Steinberg does the artwork for that as well. He unfortunately passed away prior to July of 1976, so he doesn't live to see the bicentennial, but he does have a big impact in the commemorations. This is a good example of his illustration work that he did that was printed in the commercial record of this kind of connection between the colonial era and the modern era at the Bicentennial that you can appreciate there. All right. Lots of photographs of the kinds of things you'd expect from a centennial commemoration, speechifying and music, particularly the martial and marching variety. A nice nod here to one of Saugatuck's celebrities, Bert Hillstrom of Kukla, Fran and Ollie television and puppetry fame. So 2 photographs, one from the scrapbook, an original photograph on the left, and from the commercial record, an image of Bert using some of his parade puppets as a part of that. A couple of my favorites, some floats that were featured in the Bicentennial Parade. So this is the Saugatuck Historical Museum float of the big pavilion. We've got to really up our game here at the History Center and get our floats, get our float making team organized.
That's Kit Blaine's son.
Is this her son?
And I'm sure the other side, there are other boys, there's 2 boys.
Yeah.
That's what I'm with.
That's great. Great photo of this. The Saugatuck Yacht Club won the award for most well-done float with these square-rigged boats kind of cruising down Water Street here.
Well done, but not overcooked.
And a collection of photographs that we we can just see some local flavor. One of my favorites from the scrapbook is a family pet that was walking there. What's that?
That was my dog.
That was your dog?
My husband has been.
Oh my gosh.
I
Okay.
have a picture of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the dog? Was the dog named Susie?
Susie.
So Susie is, that's you.
It's the
I didn't
dog.
make that connection. I looked at it and I saw Sanford and I didn't think about it. So there you go. That's just even richer to the story. So collection of photographs, and that's one of them. I like this. Well, you didn't get the full credit, but I guess you did later. That was added in. The dog's formal name.
Where were these from?
This is from, well, I'll tell you in just a second here. So this is indeed from that scrapbook by Jeannie Halgren. And so this is one of the last items included in the scrapbook at the end here from April 6, 1989. It was very nice. They included that date line with the story. And it's a letter to the editor from Art Lane, who's no longer running the newspaper. Remember the Bicentennial? Do you recall those carefree, less complicated days of 1976? Definitely true compared to 2026 as well. In commemoration of his birthday, it describes some of the activity of the Saugatuck Township American Revolution Bicentennial Commission. And then describes the completed work of placing some bronze plaques and other improvements at the bandstand. And then mentions here at the end, and to anyone who would like to revisit the Bicentennial, they can do so. Jeannie Halgren, Secretary of the Bicentennial Commission, has assembled letters, clippings, pictures, and other memorabilia into a beautiful scrapbook that takes you back to 1976. It will be available soon at the Saugatuck-Douglas District Library, and now at the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center. So kind of an interesting example. How do we remember the past? We really very much rely on volunteers like this, that Jeannie that put this together many years ago, 50 years ago, as a matter of fact, and has recorded this history for us. All right. Well, if there's one tradition that holds true for the Tuesday talk, it's that they can't go past noon because many people have lunch appointments and places to be. So I'm going to conclude my remarks, but thank you so much for being here at the Tuesday talk today.